The buzzing phone lit up the dark room. David glanced at the screen. "Mom." His chest tightened. It was 10:07 p.m., right on schedule. His thumb hovered over the screen, but the ringtone sliced through the silence, insistent and sharp. He sighed and picked up. "Hey, Mom. Where are you?" Her voice, cold and clipped, skipped over any greeting. The same question. Every single night. "Home," he replied flatly. His eyes flicked to Emily, his girlfriend of 4 years, curled up on the couch, her brows knitting with familiar frustration. "Alone?" Margaret pressed, her voice laced with suspicion. "With Emily," he said, keeping his tone steady. A cold silence stretched, then a soft but venomous, It wasn't always like this. David once shared everything with his mother, his dreams, his fears. But ever since he moved in with Emily 2 years ago, his mother had transformed into someone he barely recognized. Suspicious, controlling. Every conversation now felt like an interrogation. Margaret's calls were relentless. Morning texts, midday check-ins, nightly cross-examinations. But it was more than the frequency. It was the weight, the unspoken accusations behind every word. "I just don't understand why you're always so distant," she said, her voice icy but trembling. David clenched his jaw. "I'm not distant, Mom. I'm living my life." "A life without your family," she snapped, her tone sharpening. "You've changed since you met her." Emily flinched at the volume, catching his pained glance. He felt the familiar ache of being pulled apart between the woman he loved and the mother who no longer trusted him. Then came the dagger. Margaret's voice dropped, low and pointed. "You can lie to me, David, but I know. Something happened to you." David froze. His heart thudded in his chest. "What are you talking about?" Her voice, cracked with certainty and something darker. "I know why you're like this." The accusation hung, heavy and cold. Like this? What was she even implying? "Good night, Mom," he snapped, ending the call. Emily spoke softly. "David, what did she mean?" His hands trembled, his voice tight. "I don't know, but she won't stop until she breaks us." As the phone screen dimmed, so did the last fragile thread of peace. What do you think is driving Margaret's obsession? Drop your theories in the comments. Like this story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for part 2. Things are about to unravel. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, but the warmth couldn't melt the chill left from last night's call. David sat at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched, his thoughts tangled. Emily, still in her robe, placed a gentle hand on his. "She's getting worse." "David," she said softly, "I don't know how much more of this we can take." David's phone buzzed. "Mom," again. He let it ring. The voicemail came seconds later, her voice sharp but trembling. "David." "Pick up. You're hiding something from me." "But I will find out." 2 hours later, his phone lit up again, this time. A message from his childhood friend, Josh. "Dude, your mom called me." She was intense. Kept asking if something happened to you when we were kids. She said it was important. "You okay?" David's stomach nodded. "She called Josh? What the hell is she doing?" Another ping, a group chat notification. His high school friends were buzzing. "Bro, your mom just called me." "What's going on?" "She thinks something bad happened to you when we were kids." David's hand shook. His mother wasn't just harassing him. She was dragging his friends into her delusions. That evening, David called her. "Mom? What the hell are you doing calling my friends?" Margaret's voice was steady but cold. "Because they know something, and they're hiding it." "Hiding what?" "Mom?" David snapped. "You're making a fool of yourself." Her voice cracked, but her words hit like a whip. "I know you were hurt when you were little, and I know you never told me." David's heart pounded. "What are you talking about? You've changed," she whispered, her voice tight with pain. "Ever since you were a teenager, something's been wrong. I feel it. And ever since you met her, it's like you're hiding who you really are." David's voice was razor sharp. You're not trying to protect me. You're trying to control me. Then, with venom, she said it. You didn't choose this life. Something twisted you, and I won't let you destroy yourself. His blood ran cold. The next day, Emily's phone buzzed. She frowned. Margaret. She hesitated but answered. Margaret's tone was oddly soft, almost pleading. Emily, I need to know. Has David ever told you about anything from his childhood? Emily's eyes narrowed. What are you getting at? Margaret's voice dropped, heavy with implication. I believe something happened to him. Something that changed him. I'm afraid he's not being honest with you. Emily's face flushed. Margaret, I know David better than anyone. You're crossing a line. But Margaret's next word sent a chill down Emily's spine. You think you know him? What if I told you someone hurt him and he liked it? Emily's breath caught. What the hell are you saying? Margaret's voice was ice. He's living a lie. You deserve to know the truth, and I'll prove it before he ruins both your lives. That night, Emily confronted David. She called me. She thinks something happened to you. She thinks you're hiding something from me. David's face drained of color. She said that to you? Emily's voice cracked, torn between anger and confusion. What the hell is going on? David, why is she so obsessed with your past? David's fists clenched. Because she's lost in her own damn darkness. And now, she's dragging you into it. The next morning, a neighbor sent David a link, a Facebook post from his mother, Margaret O'Connor. I've tried everything to help my son, but he's surrounded by people hiding the truth. If anyone from our town knows what really happened to him, I beg you, come forward. This is about saving his life. The comments section was a wildfire. What happened to David? Is he okay? Why would his own mother post this? David's vision blurred with rage. She's made my life a public circus. David stormed into his childhood home, his voice thunderous. What the hell is wrong with you? Margaret stood, unflinching. I did what I had to. I won't watch you destroy your life with lies. You're not saving me, he roared. You're ruining me. Margaret's voice cracked, but her eyes blazed. No, I'm saving you from what ruined me. The town of Willowbrook had always been small, too small for secrets. Yet, David now felt like he was drowning in whispers, each one sharper than the last. It started with the stares, the lingering, questioning eyes whenever he passed Main Street. Then came the murmurs, low, but loud enough to burn. Poor boy. Can't believe his mother had to post something like that. Do you think it's true? Something happened to him? I always thought there was something off about him. David's phone buzzed endlessly. Friends, old neighbors, even his boss. His once quiet life was now a spectacle, and at the center of the chaos, Margaret. That night, David scoured through his childhood belongings, desperate to understand why his mother was so obsessed. He flipped through photo albums, each image a memory, but none a clue, until his hand brushed against something unusual. A torn envelope, yellowed with time. No address, no stamp. Inside, a crumpled letter, written in a hand he barely recognized but signed with a name that sent a jolt through his chest. Thomas O'Connor, his father. Dear Margaret, I write this knowing you may never forgive me, but you must know the truth before it destroys us. I never told you what really happened that summer. The day David went missing in the orchard, you were frantic. But when we found him, he wasn't harmed. He was with someone you knew, someone you trusted. But David never spoke of it. He was too young to understand. And I let silence cover what I should have confronted. You blamed yourself. But Margaret, it wasn't you. It was. The letter ended there, torn. The final words ripped from history. David's heart pounded. Missing. I went missing. He searched his mind for any fragment of memory, but found only a void. The next morning, he stormed into his mother's house, the letter clutched tight. You lied to me? Margaret's eyes darkened. You found it. What happened to me? He demanded. Her voice, cold and bitter. They all lied. The whole damn town, because they wanted to protect him. Who? David's voice cracked. Margaret's lips curled. Your uncle. David's knees weakened. Uncle Richard, his father's brother, his childhood hero. Margaret's voice trembled, laced with venom. The day you disappeared, You were with him. But when we found you, you couldn't speak. You just stared. The sheriff said there was no evidence of anything. But I knew. I felt it. Her eyes blazed with pain. I wanted him locked up. But your father, his own brother, chose silence. David's world shattered. You built your entire obsession on something you never proved? Margaret's voice cracked. I watched you change. You stopped talking. You stopped smiling. And then, years later, when you moved in with her, it was like you were hiding from yourself. David's fury erupted. So you painted me into your nightmare. You tore apart my life, my relationship, because of your paranoia. Margaret. Her voice a whisper. I was protecting you. David's voice, cold and cutting. No, you were protecting yourself. From guilt, from truth, from him. The next day, David visited the town's only library, digging through old newspaper archives, and there it was, buried and faded. July 16th, 2002, missing child found in orchard. No foul play suspected. Witness statement, local resident Richard O'Connor says he found the boy and returned him safely. David's stomach churned. His uncle was the witness. The hero, he found something else. A classified police report, partially redacted but not fully erased from the digital archive. July 18th, 2002, Richard O'Connor, questioned regarding inappropriate conduct complaints from local families. No charges filed. Case closed due to lack of evidence. David's breath stopped. He stumbled from the library, his chest heaving. The accusations weren't just his mother's delusions. There were others. But the town buried it. His father buried it. And he, David, had buried the memory. But why? Why couldn't he remember? That night, David confronted his father. Thomas, frail, silent, but with eyes that carried decades of regret. David's voice shook. You knew. Thomas's lips trembled. I thought. I was protecting you. No. David's voice broke. You protected him. David's body shook with anger. Mom destroyed my life chasing a ghost. But you let him walk free. Thomas's voice. Barely a whisper. It was. Too late. I thought you'd forgotten. David's voice. Cold and final. I may have forgotten. But now, I'll never forgive. The night was heavy with tension, the air thick with unspoken truths. David stood at the threshold of his childhood home, his knuckles white from clenching. Inside, shadows danced under the dim chandelier, a house that once held warmth, now a battleground. The front door creaked open. Margaret appeared, her face gaunt but her eyes sharp with defiance. Behind her, Thomas frail, silent, and haunted. David's voice sliced through the silence. No more lies. Tonight, we finish this. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. You've always had the truth. David, you just refused to see it. Thomas's voice, weak but trembling. Son, please. But David's fury erupted. Don't call me that. Fathers protect their children. You protected a monster. Margaret stepped forward, her voice like a blade. I told you what he did. And you, she turned, her glare burning into Thomas. You chose silence over justice. Thomas's voice cracked. I didn't know. But David's fist slammed the table, rattling the room. You knew enough. Margaret's voice, laced with cold fire. The day you disappeared, I felt it in my bones. But no one believed me. Not the sheriff. Not him. Her eyes burned into Thomas. David's voice, raw with anguish. You spent your life chasing shadows, but you ruined me in the process. Margaret's voice broke, brittle and sharp. Because I couldn't save you. So I tried to save you from yourself. Suddenly, Thomas snapped. His voice, hollow and trembling. I kept quiet because I was afraid. The room froze. David's heart pounded. Afraid of what? Dad? Thomas's eyes glistened. His voice barely a whisper. Afraid you'd remember. The silence was deafening. David's knees weakened. You knew? Thomas's voice cracked. That day, I found you. Alone, shaking. You looked at me and said, his voice broke into a whisper. Don't tell Mommy. David's world imploded. You knew. David's voice shook with cold fury. You knew. And you let him go. Thomas collapsed into a chair, his hands trembling. I thought if we forgot, if we buried it. Thomas's voice. Broken. I tried to confront him, but his voice wavered. He threatened. You. He said if I spoke, David's stomach twisted. You chose cowardice over your own son. Suddenly, Margaret moved. She reached beneath the couch and pulled out a gun. David's breath caught. Mom. Her hands trembled, but her eyes blazed. No more silence. Thomas's voice, panicked. Margaret, don't. But she aimed, not at Thomas and at herself. Her voice, cracked and raw. I've lived in a prison of his lies, and your cowardice. No! David lunged. Bang! The shot rang out, shattering the air. The room, the family. The air was heavy with smoke and silence. The gun clattered to the floor. Margaret's body collapsed, alive, but wounded, her shoulder bleeding, her chest heaving. David's hands pressed against the wound, his voice shaking. Mom, stay with me. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but burning with something deeper than pain. Release. Her voice, faint. No more lies. The police arrived. Sirens. Paramedics. Chaos. Thomas, handcuffed. His face pale and hollow. I was trying to protect, but no one listened. The silence he kept was his crime. As Margaret was lifted into the ambulance, her bloody hand gripped David's weakly. You were always my truth. I'm sorry. I hurt you. Chasing ghosts. David's voice cracked, tears falling freely. You didn't chase ghosts. You chased justice. The air in the hospital room was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic, but the tension between David and his mother, Margaret, was anything but clean. The machines beeped steadily beside her, a fragile rhythm keeping time with the chaos of their shattered family. Margaret's voice, weak but sharp. You know, there's more. Don't you? David's fists clenched. More than you nearly killing yourself to tell me. His voice cracked, raw from too many unanswered questions. Her eyes, tired, haunted, locked on his. Your father, and he didn't just protect him. He protected something bigger. Hours later, with Margaret sedated, David returned to the wreckage of his childhood home. Furniture overturned, shattered glass from the confrontation still glinting on the floor. But it wasn't the chaos that drew his eye. It was a safe, partially exposed behind the collapsed bookshelf. The safe had always been there, but the key, that was new. It lay on the floor, dropped from his father's pocket during the chaos. With trembling hands, David opened it. Inside, a stack of documents, an old photo album, and a sealed letter, marked with his father's handwriting. To my son, for when the truth finds you. David, if you're reading this, I failed you in every way that matters. But the truth you seek has always been larger than me, larger than our family. I kept silent because what I knew could destroy more than a man's life. It could shatter an entire legacy. Your Uncle Richard was a monster. Yes, but he was also a guardian of secrets. Secrets that the entire O'Connor family built its fortune upon. I tried to confront him, but he warned me, if I exposed him, he would reveal something that could ruin us all. Our wealth, your inheritance, was never clean. It was built on exploitation, corruption, and worse. But what broke me, David, was you. Because you saw it, and you forgot. But what if he made you forget? David's head spun. His body trembled as fragmented memories, long buried, began to surface. A cold room, the scent of cigar smoke, a voice familiar, oily, whispering threats, and a sharp, burning sensation in his arm. His breath quickened. A needle. He drugged me? The memories hit like shards of glass. Painful, disjointed. Richard hadn't just assaulted him, he had erased him. With shaking hands, David opened the photo album from the safe. There, buried between happy family photos, were Polaroids. His uncle, Richard, laughing with powerful men from the town, the sheriff, the mayor, and Judge Miller. A photo of young David at a charity gala, standing beside Richard, his eyes glassy, his smile vacant. And behind one photo, a scribbled note, "Don't let him remember." David's stomach turned. The town hadn't ignored the truth. They had protected Richard because he protected them. The abuse wasn't just personal. It was systemic. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. "Unknown number. You've found enough. Drop it, or you'll join your father." David's blood froze. His father was in custody. Not dead, wasn't he? Before he could think, his phone rang again. The hospital. The nurse's voice, shaking. "Sir, your father, there was an incident." David arrived at the hospital, his heart pounding. He was too late. Thomas lay still, eyes closed, chest silent. A nurse pressed her lips tight. A sudden cardiac arrest. But she hesitated. The doctor suspects something unnatural. David's knees buckled. His father, cowardly, broken, had taken every sin to the grave. Or was he silenced? But before grief could consume him, a voice broke through the void. Margaret, awake, out of bed, stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing with grim resolve. "You know now, don't you?" David's voice, hollow and burning, everything. Her voice, trembling but fierce. "Then you know what you have to do." David's fists clenched. "If I expose them, our family name, your life, everything will burn." Margaret's voice, thin but sharp as a blade. "Then let it burn." Her eyes softened, glistening with something raw and real. "I tried to fight this, my way. I failed. But you can't let their rot live through you. End it, or they win forever." "David," his throat tight, whispered, "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Margaret's cold, trembling hand found his. "Then, be angry enough." That night, David acted. He didn't hide in the shadows. He lit them. The police chief, the judge, the mayor, their names, their crimes splashed across social media. Anonymous videos of secret meetings, of bribes, found their way to the press. And then, Richard's file, front page of every outlet. The town erupted. The police chief resigned. The mayor indicted. The judge under federal investigation. And Richard vanished. But David knew this wasn't over. In the rubble of their dynasty, David stood alone, his name scorched, his family fortune ashes. Margaret, watching the news from her hospital bed, smiled. Her voice, faint but triumphant. Finally, the silence is dead. The world David once knew lay in ruins. His family name a curse, his inheritance ashes, his father dead, his mother broken, recovering in a cold hospital bed, and him alone, trapped in the wreckage of truth and betrayal. But the storm hadn't passed. It was only gathering strength. The news had spread like wildfire. The O'Connor name a headline, a scandal. Strangers pointed. Friends vanished. And enemies, they watched. David's phone buzzed with threats. You think you're a hero? Dead men don't finish stories. You ruined the wrong people. O'Connor, sleep with one eye open. His hands trembled. His body screamed for rest, but his mind, too sharp with fear, refused. At the hospital, Margaret was awake, but their bond lay shattered. David stood at her bedside, his voice cold. You got what you wanted. They're burning. Margaret's eyes, sunken but fierce, met his as we burned. And from the ashes, you'll rise. David's voice cracked. His fists clenched. Rise? I lost everything because you couldn't let go. Her voice, soft but sharp. I couldn't let go of you. Days passed. David, consumed by fear and fury, pushed everyone away. Emily's calls went unanswered. His mother's words, ignored. He was drowning in the silence, the same silence that had cursed their family for years. But the silence wouldn't last. It was shattered by a single knock. The door creaked open, and there stood Richard. David's blood ran cold. His voice, a hiss, you. Richard smiled, cold, calculated. You've made quite the mess. Nephew. David's fists curled. Get out. But Richard's voice, like oil, slid into every crack. You destroyed our legacy, but legacies can be rebuilt. Richard's tone dripped with venom. You want peace? Power. I can make your name clean again. Money. Connections. You'll be untouchable. David's heart pounded with rage. You think I'd sell my soul to you? Richard's eyes narrowed. You already did. The day you covered your father's sins. David's voice, trembling. I exposed you. Richard's smirk cut deep. You exposed a story, but I own the truth. You can burn it all down, or rule what's left. Suddenly, a voice, weak but razor sharp. Step away from my son. Margaret, pale, frail, stood in the doorway. Her eyes, blazing with something ancient and unstoppable, met Richard's. I should have killed you years ago. Richard chuckled coldly. You never had the spine. Margaret's voice cracked with venom. No. But he does. Richard's eyes flicked back to David. Then choose, boy, me or the ruin you've created. The air, thick, electric, waiting for the explosion. David's chest heaved, his heart a thunderstorm of rage and fear. But within the chaos, a clarity emerged. David's voice, low, steady, and deadly. I choose truth. And with that, he pressed record on his phone. Richard's face twisted. David's voice, clear and cold. The world knows your crimes. Now they'll know your face. Richard lunged, but bang. The gun Margaret smoked. Richard staggered. His eyes wide with shock, fell. The room fell deathly silent, except for his final, rattling breath. Margaret, her body shaking. The gun falling from her hand, collapsed. David, rushing to her side, caught her as she sank. Her voice, faint. It's over. David's hands, cradling hers, whispered, It has to be. Sirens, lights. Police flooded the scene. Margaret arrested. Her body frail, her spirit unbreakable. David alone, his heart in ruins. But his phone buzzed. A notification, live video. David O'Connor exposes family scandal. 100K watching, 200K, 500K, 1 million. The truth, no longer his burden, was the world's. Days passed. Headlines screamed, Family dynasty falls. O'Connor scandal ends in blood. Richard O'Connor dead. Margaret O'Connor charged. Hero or villain? David O'Connor's fight for truth. The world spoke. But David, silent. The prison visiting room, cold, gray. But inside, a warmth. Fragile but real. Margaret behind the glass. David before it. No rage, no lies. Only the truth. Margaret's voice, soft, proud. You did what I couldn't. David's eyes, wet. His voice, raw. I wish it didn't cost everything. Margaret, smiling through her tears. But it bought you, yourself. Weeks turned to months. The headlines faded. But from the rubble, David rebuilt. His mother, incarcerated, but free of her ghosts. His father, gone, but his sins buried with him. His uncle, a warning, not a curse, and himself scarred, but finally whole. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers, cameras flashing from every corner. Margaret O'Connor, once a woman feared and hated, now stood frail and exposed before the world, awaiting her fate. David sat behind her, his heart a battlefield of guilt and resolve. The woman who had destroyed him and saved him now faced prison. And he had put her there. The judge, an older black woman with eyes carved from experience, cleared her throat. Margaret O'Connor, you are charged with second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? Margaret's voice, soft but firm, rang through the hall. I did what a mother does. I fought for my son, even if it cost me everything. Her eyes flicked briefly to David. I regret the pain I caused him, but I do not regret fighting for him. The courtroom silent, the world watching. Suddenly, a voice broke through. Your Honor, may I speak? Heads turned. A man, middle-aged, dressed simply, his eyes heavy with emotion, rose from the benches. The judge's brow arched. And you are? The man's voice, steady but raw. My name is Patrick Lewis, and I'm here because of her. He pointed to Margaret. David's pulse quickened. Who is this man? Patrick's voice carried through the courtroom. 20 years ago, I was nobody, just another kid lost in the cracks of this town. But one night, he pointed at Margaret, saved my life. The judge's eyes narrowed. Explain. Patrick's voice thickened. I was 17, homeless, starving, and I tried to rob her store. But instead of calling the cops, she fed me, and then she hired me. His voice cracked, raw with memory. She told me, the world is cruel, but you don't have to be. Patrick's hand trembled as he continued. I didn't just get a job. I got a life. She pushed me to get my GED. She helped me apply to college. And when I wanted to quit, because I felt like I didn't belong, she drove to my campus and told me, belonging isn't something you're given, it's something you take. The courtroom hung on every word. Even Margaret's hardened face softened. Patrick's eyes met the judge's. Today, I'm a social worker. And every kid I save, every life I change, is because she changed mine first. Patrick turned fully to the judge, his voice pleading. I'm not here to erase what she's done, but I'm asking you to see who she is. The woman behind the headlines. The woman behind the fire. I stand here because she believed I was more than my worst mistake. So please, believe the same for her. The judge silent. Her eyes, sharp but softened by something deeply human. Then, her gavel struck. I have considered your plea, Lewis, and I have reviewed Mrs. O'Connor's life. In full measure, both her crimes and her kindness. The room held its breath. The judge's voice rang clear. Margaret O'Connor, for the crime of second-degree murder. I sentence you to 10 years imprisonment, with eligibility for parole in 2 years. Gasps. The judge, gently but firmly, I do not condone violence, but justice without compassion is vengeance. And society should not punish a woman more than it has already punished itself, by creating the monsters she fought. Her gavel fell. Margaret, her eyes wide with disbelief, turned only to see David, his face broken with tears. He stood and walked toward her, every step heavy with the weight of their war. Then he spoke, Mom, you didn't lose me. You found me, and I'll be here when you come home. As they took her away, Patrick approached David, his eyes wet but warm. She saved me once, I hope. I helped save her. David's voice, low but grateful. You did more than save her. You reminded me who she was. The prison gates clanged shut behind him, but David's heart felt open. For the first time in his life, there were no shadows chasing him, only the road ahead. 2 years had passed. The air was crisp as David stepped into the visiting room, his palms warm but his heart steady. And there, Margaret, her hair grayer, her face lined, but her eyes softer, lighter, no longer burning with fury, only peace. She smiled. You look well. David, his voice warm but raw. I've been living. Margaret's voice.
Tender, I read about you.
The outreach work, the foundation, helping survivors like you. David nodded, his voice thick with emotion. Because of you. You taught me the cost of silence. So, I chose to listen. A pause. Then her voice, breaking but whole. I'm proud of you, David. His eyes wet, but bright. I know. Mom. Months later, David stood before a group of survivors. His story now. A beacon. He spoke not of vengeance, but of truth. Not of hate, but of healing. Pain can break us, he said, his voice steady. But it can also build us, if we choose to let it. In the crowd, faces of every color, every life heard him, because truth, once spoken, echoes. One evening, he received a letter from prison, from Margaret. David, this place has taught me something I never gave you. Peace isn't found in control, it's found in surrender. I will spend my days making amends, but I will spend my heart knowing you are free. Thank you for saving me from my anger, and thank you for forgiving me. Love. Mom. The day Margaret walked free, David was there. No cameras, no crowd, just a son waiting for his mother. And in their embrace wasn't victory, wasn't loss. It was family. If you were David, would you choose justice or forgiveness? Can a family survive the truth and still find love? If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below because your voice matters. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us, even broken hearts can heal.